Pleasure to be on. My name is Ryan Edwards. I'm a cryptozoologist and field researcher into paranormal phenomena. Pretty much how I got into cryptozoology is like any little kid. Like all little boys love monsters and animals and dinosaurs and things like that. And at a young age, I loved all the things like that, mysteries, and I fell right into the world of cryptozoology. It's kind of a mix of everything. It's mysteries, it's animals, it's zoology, a little bit of paleontology, paranormal, like has a little bit of everything. Uh, One of my earliest memories is sitting on my couch in my living room, and if you remember the show Monster Quest, the Monster Quest episode came on, and I think it was a Thunderbird episode, and I think it was like probably around 5 or 6, and at that moment I knew monsters are real. Monsters are out there in the woods that we don't know about yet. And ever since then, I was a voracious reader, watched documentaries, and then at the age of 20, I was finally able to actually publish my first book. What it was is called Cryptids of the World, and it's kind of a guidebook to all these different cryptids seen around the world. Initially, it wasn't really a book. It was like, okay, I have all this information. Let me write it down so I don't forget it. But then I was like, there's a lot of stuff here that people probably haven't heard about recently, like things like the Morosi of Kenya, things like the orang pendek that isn't really published much a lot, or the buru, a giant lizard seen in Nepal. So I decided to publish it as my first book, and that is my first of many. I am currently working on my fourth book right now.
Well, tell me, as you researched for this book, what was your process? What did you do? How did you come up with all of these various creatures to write about?
Pretty much, what I did was it was like almost like I would remember all the books I've read, things like that. Like, okay, so there's this cryptid, this cryptid, this cryptid, and then I would do the research into like, okay, I would read books about it. I would re, try to contact eyewitnesses that I would know of. But a lot of these cryptids that I do research on are very obscure. It's maybe like only one reference to it in one book in like back in the 1960s or something like that. Like that's why a lot of my research I say is kind of the old fashioned style. There's a lot of cryptids that I do a lot of research into that really aren't referenced nowadays. Like currently, I've seen a shift in cryptozoology. Like I am young, I'm only 23, but I kind of call myself an old fashioned researcher. I'm very much akin to maybe like a Carl Schuker or Lauren Coleman or Bernard Hoovermans. I look at the old style of research, the classic cryptozoology, as really my basis. So reading books like On the Track of Unknown Monsters and The Rake of Sea Serpents by Bernard Hoovermans, Cryptozoology A to Z by Lauren Coleman. Those are the really things I'd go after first, and then using the internet, using sites of like, okay, one thing is looking at the references of the books, like, okay, so let me see if I can find this article. Let me see if I can find this eyewitness account. Uh, and then in recent years, when I'm doing my current books, like for instance, what my second book, Sasquatch Prehistory, a lot of it's going into research into known species because a big aspect of my research is the biological sciences, is the zoology of cryptozoology. What is the biological basis of these creatures? What can we learn from the actual natural history and natural world? Because with cryptozoology, it comes to a couple parts. First, the cryptid itself. What's its biology? What could be its behavioral sets? What's its ecology? Because if these are natural, living, breathing creatures, it fits into the natural world somehow. And then what's its natural history? What could it have evolved from? Because animals just don't pop out of nowhere. That's just not how nature works. Like for instance, my third book, Beyond Bigfoot, the Other Unknown Primates in North America, I go into kind of a speculative evolution standpoint of like, okay, so if Sasquatch and these devil monkeys and other creatures exist, what could they have come from? Yes, it's a lot of speculation, but I like to always make the joke of like cryptozoology is a science of speculation. Like we have to use what we know in science, what we know in natural history, to speculate where these creatures came from, and see where could they fit into the niches around the world?
Well, tell me about Bigfoot and that this natural history and progression that you have researched out thoroughly. Tell me about that. Kind of where do you think they came from? How do you think they have progressed over time?
Of course. Well, with Sasquatch, personally, this is one of the cryptids I do a lot of research into because just how likely it works in the natural world. A lot of people see Bigfoot as it's, of course, it's a large primate just from the simple morphology of this creature. It's large, 6 to 9 feet tall, bipedal, which is one big thing that it's the separation of it is a lot of people when it comes to the physical living breeding Sasquatch theorists, there are two camps. I always like to say there are the is it human, then is it an ape? I'm very much it's an ape species, and there's a couple reasons I go off of that. One main reason is actually people have not done a lot of research into this is Sasquatch hands. There's only a few Sasquatch handprints, and when you look at these handprints, they are indicative of a large-bodied primate, something very akin to a gorilla, something like that. Their fingers are a lot more stubbier than ours. Their thumb is a lot more distally placed down the hand, so precision grip is something Sasquatch cannot do. That's something indicative of Homo sapiens, especially like even Australopithecines and early ancestors had that ability. Second of all, their behavioral sets. When it comes to humans, like Australopithecines, Homo erectus, when there is fossil evidence of these creatures, there's also congruent fossil evidence of tool use. Things like early tools will go back to almost 2 million years. But when it comes to Sasquatch, we don't really see tool use. We don't see uses of fire or usage of rocks. We see them using like rocks to throw at people. We don't see them using spearheads or something like that. So that makes me really think this is indicative of a ape species. Now we have to come to what type of ape species is this creature? There are two major candidates I use for Sasquatch. One is, of course, Gigantopithecus, but honestly, I put that in my book, but I don't really think Bigfoot's Gigantopithecus. That's one thing that I differ with a lot of people nowadays. Because when we look at Gigantopithecus, this was a large ape that existed in Asia around 100,000 years ago. Discovered by Wolfgang Klungswald in the 1930s, the Chinese thought these were dragon teeth, but then when they discovered them, they were giant ape molars. When we see Giganto, we've done carbon dating of like their teeth and also isonomic dating of their teeth, and we've seen that these creatures are primarily uh, herbivores. They primarily eat what we call seed-three plants, things like bamboo, leaves, grasses, things like that. When it comes to Sasquatch, we see a totally different diet. We see a creature that is a highly well-known omnivore. We've had stories of them hunting deer, of them eating squirrels, of them hunting salmon, of them eating berries, things like that. So this is a omnivore, not exactly the giant carnivore people think of, but this is an omnivore. This is a niche, and then they're also the morphologies are very different too. When it comes to this giganto, a lot of people make reconstructions of it being bipedal. Me personally, I think it's indicative. This creature is indicative of an actual quadruped, most likely with that size, because people bring up Gigantopithecus because just the sheer size of it. It was probably around 1,000 to 2,000 pounds, which me personally shows that primates can get that large. It shows us that. So why can't other primates get that large? This when it comes to Sasquatch, my major candidate for it is a group of primates called Dryopithecus. Dryopithecines were literally means oak ape. These creatures lived in oak forests. They lived in swampy areas. They lived in oak forests, very akin to modern day Pacific Northwest, modern day Florida. But the big thing is that Dryopithecines lived in Europe about in the Miocene about 20 million years ago. And these creatures have morphologies indicative of bipedal locomotion. When it comes to modern day research into bipedalism, we used to have the idea that okay, the only bipedal apes were humans, and we became bipedal thanks to shrinking forests and larger savannas. Now, a lot of paleoanthropologists, including myself, believe these creatures have bipedalism thanks to what we call tree clambering. They would walk along the tops of tree branches, and Drypithecines have this morphology. They have a larger sternum, a larger torso that suggests a bipedal locomotion. They're what we call the intermembral index. That means the length of your arms to your legs. Are very akin to humans. Gorillas, it's 1 to point 0.5. They have much longer arms than legs, suggesting quadrupedal locomotion. Humans, it's 1 to 1. We have as long as our legs, as long as our arms, suggesting bipedal locomotion. When it comes to Drypithecines, like Rhodopithecus, Drypithecus itself, and Oreopithecus, they have 1 to point 0.8, right between human and ape. And what do we describe Bigfoot as? Right between human and ape. And it's interesting too because when you look at the intermembral index of Patty, the subject in the Patterson Gimlin film, she has an intermembral index of 1 to point 0.8, the exact same as a Drypithecine. And now, when it comes to Drypithecines, these creatures lived in parts of Africa, parts of Europe, even parts of Asia, almost as far east as parts of Siberia. Now we have to come to the idea of like, okay, if these things lived in Miocene Europe and Asia, how did they reach North America? Around 20 million years, there were many land bridges that connected Asia and North America uh, uh, in modern day Beringia. Animals we know of that crossed this area were like horses. Horses left from North America to Asia and parts of Europe. We know a lot of animals like proboscideans or elephants moved into North America. Why couldn't these Drypithecines have moved from Asia to North America? Because if they did in modern day in Alaska at that time and parts of Canada, they would have found an environment very indicative of a primate, especially for them. Because if you had taken a safari on in Miocene North America, you would have said you're in Africa, not in modern day like Yellowstone, because we had camels, we had gazelles, we had horses, we had giant American lions that were the size of grizzly bears. We had Smilodon. We had real life monsters. So one thing I look at with Sasquatch is especially its prehistory. I think it's a piece of megafauna that has survived into the modern day thanks to its evolution, thanks to adaptation, especially its intelligence.
Well, that's fascinating. Absolutely, very interesting perspective of Bigfoot's history. Out of all of the cryptids that you have researched and studied, which one would you say is your favorite?
That is a hard part because I'm pretty sure I switch it on almost every other day. Of course, Sasquatch has got to be a favorite. It's the one that really I do most of my research into. But honestly, one that's truly I would say a favorite is a cryptid that got me into cryptozoology. Thunderbirds. Thunderbirds. I have a little bit of Cherokee in my own blood, so the Cherokee Thunderbirds are very well known within Cherokee mythology. And also, it's the one that really got me into cryptozoology. I live in San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio, Texas, back in the 70s and 80s, had several large bird sightings. Heck, not even 6 miles away from where I currently live right now. So these are really the ones that got me into like, okay, these cryptids aren't just living out in the middle of the woods or like thousands of miles away from me. They're sightings less than 100 miles away from me. So this is really the cryptid that got me into doing field research and also looking into historical documents and reaching out to cryptozoologists. For instance, a well-known cryptozoologist and good friend of mine, Ken Gerhard, lives right here in town with me. And I remember when I first reached out to him, he was doing a lecture at a local library. I went there and I talked to him and talked to him about my book, and we've been friends ever since. So, me personally, probably my favorite cryptid is the Thunderbird. It's a really good, really strong personal connection to me.
Tell me a little bit about the Thunderbird. Of course, I've heard of this, and I've done a few interviews with people that claim to have seen something like this. But Yeah, tell me about the history of the Thunderbird and have you ever seen one?
Of course. Me personally, I have not had any sightings of a Thunderbird. With me, I don't have any cryptid sightings that I know of. I've done some field research. I've heard some peculiar noises in the woods, but that's pretty much the extent. Even though I might possibly have a family member that has had a Thunderbird sighting. One of my uncles once talked about when he went to Oklahoma went back in the 70s, and a large bird shadow crossed the highway, both sides of the highway. So that's suggesting a wingspan about 20 feet. And that's about what people describe Thunderbirds as. They usually describe them as large birds, usually very akin to like a vulture or like even a California condor. Wingspan between 12 to 20 feet wide, dark feathers, usually black. Some have suggested a white wing of feathers around the neck, very akin to an Andean condor. Usually the head's described as like very vulture-like, very like skin, no feathers on the head, indicative of a scavenger. And when you look at the natural history of prehistory of North America, we have had giant birds here in the past. One well known is Pterotonus. Pterotonus was a giant vulture from Pleistocene North America that had a wingspan about 12 to 18 feet wide. And people describe these sightings all across North America. There have been certain what we call flaps that have opened up like multiple sightings at one time. For instance, Pennsylvania back in the 60s, back in the early 2000s, Alaska had a lot of sightings. And here in Texas, back in the 70s and 80s, from Oklahoma all the way down to the southern border with Brownsville and like Mexico, we had dozens of sightings of Thunderbird sightings. For instance, one well-known sighting that people count as Thunderbird, but some people describe it as something else, happened down in southern San Antonio. Three school teachers were driving along a road on the south side. They looked in this field and they described a giant flying bird flying parallel to them along this field. They went to the school, they looked in the library, they couldn't identify what this creature was, and then they found it in a book of dinosaurs. They described seeing a pterosaur, like a pteranodon almost. And this is something that's also caught my interest in years too, because of course, as a kid, I love dinosaurs, and we have a lot of sightings of living pterosaurs or living like dinosaurs in modern day, and that's something that also has very much piqued my interest.
You mentioned something earlier about a cryptid that was like a lizard of some sort. What can you tell me about that one?
Yes, that's a little less known cryptid, something called the Buru. The Buru honestly has not been really. There hasn't been any documented sightings since I think probably around the 70s. People describe it as pretty much a giant monitor lizard, very much akin to like a Komodo dragon, but this creature is seen in Nepal, in parts of the Himalayas, but not in the snowfields, down in like the steamy forest and jungles and the foothills of the Himalayas. One well-known cryptozoologist I know that did a couple sighting references of this creature was Bernard Hoovermans back in the 1960s. But as to my knowledge, I don't think there's been any sightings of this creature since around 1976. But that's also the thing too. That's kind of the hard thing with cryptozoology, especially here in America, is that a lot of these international cryptids don't. There's not a lot of like here in North America, we have the BFRO, we have the North American Dogman Association, we have all these different organizations. Internationally, there's not a lot of these cryptozoological organizations. So when there are sightings of these creatures, first of all, you have to have a person to see it. And second of all, you have to have a person. That person needs to know who to report it to, or it just becomes a story that gets lost in time. So a lot of these international cryptids, like I've always wondered about, because there's not a lot of researchers that are going out there talking to the locals, talking to indigenous populations anymore, and really getting the research because first of all, people in North America might not even heard of these cryptids in the first place. For instance, currently right now, I'm working on my fourth book about cryptids in Africa. And in Africa, there is a long history of cryptids, but a lot of these cryptids, especially the Congolese cryptids like Mokema Bembe, Milanatoka, and Nguni Monin, have only been referenced in maybe one or two books. And Maybe there's an expedition to go look for these creatures maybe once every 10 years by people like William Gibbons or Roy Mackal. And then that also kind of comes into like almost like an information bottleneck because these cryptids have been talked about, but there's only been like one or two cryptozoologists that have really done serious field research into these creatures due to lack of funding. Like that's something that even I've had to do with myself, and also a lack of just information because a lot of stories, of course, internationally are old. They are talked about from person to person, but not really written down. And then we have to deal with also the ideas of cultural perspectives, especially with international cryptids, because like parts of Africa, parts of Asia, a lot of these cryptids get mixed in with what I like to call colonial thinking. For instance, when I'm doing my Africa right now, Africa was always seen as a dark continent. It was seen as a mysterious primordial world. And when cryptozoologists first got into Africa about in the 1960s through the late 1800s, they saw that Africa as that, and they brought their own kind of perspectives into Africa, which kind of altered the cryptids that were seen there. Like, for instance, Mokema Bembe. Initially, the indigenous described this creature as a more akin to a rhino or more akin to an elephant because it was most likely a cultural memory of elephants. But when a lot of North American, like a lot of like especially European researchers got these descriptions, they made it into a more akin to like a sauropod dinosaur, like a brontosaurus or a patasaur. And that is what we see in the modern day research, not exactly what the indigenous were originally talking about. And that's something that I bring up with cryptozoology a lot is keeping the original indigenous stories and not putting European or North American or modern perspectives into it because it muddies the water so much. And that's something with cryptozoology, especially, is just keeping the information and also documenting the information because there's so many stories out there that we probably never hear, or you will never, or maybe only one person's heard because the lack of documentation.
Absolutely. And the eyewitnesses that you've talked to, what are some of the things that they're telling you?
Most of the eyewitnesses I've talked to, especially are based here in Texas. One couple cryptids that I usually get eyewitness accounts of it. Down here, especially, we have stories of the Lechusa or the owl woman. Described as like a giant owl, but these are seen as more witchcraft creatures. These are seen as witches that can, or brujas that can transform from human into these giant white owls. Even boss of mine, she talked about driving home, and here in San Antonio, we don't have snowy owls. We don't have white owls. She turned this corner, and there's this giant white owl in the street that she said is stood like 3 or 4 feet tall. And it looked at her, and then she drove almost a foot next to it, then it finally flew off. And that's very peculiar behavior. Is it, do I think these are humans that are transforming into owls? Not really, because I'm very much a science based type of researcher. But maybe this could be a unknown species of owl that we have not discovered down here. Another thing a lot of people have referenced me with, especially with eyewitnesses, is Sasquatch sightings. For instance, a good friend of mine, Rod Nichols, he's a guy named, he's known as Bear County Bigfoot. He's gotten reports of Sasquatch literally within the city limits of San Antonio. And our population is 1.5 million people. What we think is that there are natural creek beds, things like the Salado Creek that are here in San Antonio that animals, maybe like Sasquatch, could use as natural corridors. A good friend of mine, Lyle Blackburn, he always talks about they always follow the creeks, like what they talk about in the Legend of Bog Creek. These animals use natural highways like this, creek bottoms, river bottoms, to move around areas and possibly into areas around big cities that humans don't really get to. That people might walk a trail on it, but they don't walk a trail at night. So maybe these animals could be using these areas as ways to travel along these creek beds. For instance, my friend Rod and I have found tree structures out in these natural parks along this creek bed that don't look human made. It looks like something like a Sasquatch could have made these tree structures. But as of my knowledge, we don't have any signs of people that have seen a Bigfoot in that area. So it's very much a secondary information. It's very much no one's seen these creatures. One big thing is when me personally talking to eyewitnesses and doing the field research is one part of the research I try to do as much as I can, but due to me being a full-time educator, also working, going to college, and also doing a lot of other things, going out there doing field research is very much a secondary thing. It's something I really can't do nowadays. And talking to eyewitnesses, especially, I try to do that as much as I can, but due to, I guess, I don't know, not like a people skills, but just a lack of just reaching out to the community as much as I really can. That's a kind of a part of the research that I really don't do. I'm very much a person that I look at the like historical sightings. I look at the like I'm very much the more person that looks at the that reads the books than out there talking to the people. Like I try to go to conferences as much as I can and talk to eyewitnesses and get reports and things like that. But then like follow ups are really the hard part of like, okay, when I do eyewitness accounts, I would want to go out there and go to the sighting, go talk to the person in the field and things like that. Which that's the very much part of research that's so hard to do because it's how time excessive it is.
Exactly. Well, and tell us again the name of your new book that's going to be coming out.
That new book, it's not right now. It's still in the publishing stages, so hopefully next year or so it should be Cryptids of Africa. But my most current book, Beyond Bigfoot, the other unrecognized primates in North America, just released this time last year, and then Sasquatch Prehistory is my second book, and that released also earlier, about late last year.
And how can someone go about finding these books?
Of course, these books are available on Amazon. If you look up to Ryan Edwards Cryptids, you'll find all three of my books on there. They're also available on Barnes and Noble, Half Price Books, things like that. I'm also available on my social medias. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, things like that. You can always reach out to me, and I can give you guys the links, things like that. And also, people have questions or they just want to learn a little bit more about cryptids, I'm always open to people reaching out to me because my 9 to 5, I'm a full time educator. I'm a history teacher. So I'm very much, when it comes to cryptozoology, is the educational side of sharing information and teaching people about these creatures.
Well, you have a wealth of information about cryptids, and I appreciate you coming on and sharing all that information with us.
Of course, it was great being on, Linda.
Okay, I'll let you know when this comes out.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.